name is Guillem Balaguer. I'm the author of this Maradona biography, The Boy, the Rebel, the God, that just been published by SQN Publishing. And I've just had a very long but very interesting conversation from Carol from this YouTube channel, and I want you to subscribe if you haven't done it, but if you are watching perhaps because you have subscribed, even though, no, this is probably in social media, which means that you need to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe, watch it all. It'll be subtitled in English, no, I'm speaking English, it'll be in Spanish and Polish, and everything you need to know about Maradona will be there, but we're also talking about